Hello and welcome back to IO Psych. In Chapter 6, we're going to talk about how to evaluate selection techniques and selection decisions. So let's jump into our learning objectives. So by the end of this chapter, you're going to be able to understand how to determine the utility of a selection test. You're going to be able to evaluate a test for potential legal problems, and you're going to be able to understand how to use test scores to make personnel selection decisions. All right, so obviously selection is a really important factor on the I side of IO Psych, because I think this is our third chapter discussing selection decisions. So let's get into it. All right, so defining criteria and their properties. Okay, so criteria or criterion would be an evaluative standard for measuring employees' success or failure. So generally there are multiple criteria for evaluating employees' success or failure. So criteria, right? So these are going to be our benchmarks for determining employee success or failure. So we can use these criteria not just for selection, so it's worth an organization's time to work these up, because you can use them for appraising employee performance, for training program evaluation to determine whether that training program is working or not. Selection validation. Okay, you've made your selection decision, but was it a good one? And then layoff and promotion decisions. So we can use these criteria for lots of different purposes that are really useful for organizations. And then, of course, performance would be any kind of on-the-job behaviors that are relevant to the organization's goals. We oftentimes refer to this as the criterion. In fact, a couple of chapters ago, that's how I introduced it. We oftentimes will shorthand it just to performance, or we might call it the performance criterion. So there's multiple words that all basically mean performance, the on-the-job behaviors that are relevant to the organization's goals. All right, now, the ultimate criterion is kind of, what do you call it? I want to say mythical, but that's not the word I want. But it is, it's like mythical. It doesn't really exist, right? Because it encompasses all aspects of performance that define success on the job. So obviously this is not going to be something that is directly observable. Thorndike, who is a different Thorndike than the behaviorist Thorndike, if you're familiar with him. This is not the person who came up with the law of effect, for example. This is a IO psychologist called Robert L. Thorndike, and he wrote the personnel selection book. And he said that the ultimate criterion is very complex and it's not directly accessible. So we can never really completely define all the characteristics and aspects of performance that define success on the job. We can't measure every aspect of performance that defines success on the job. It's not going to happen. So that's what I meant by it's kind of mythical. It's a concept, right? It's something that we all kind of understand, but there's no way to make it concrete. All right, so what we're probably going to do is focus on the actual criterion, which is going to be the best real-world representation of the ultimate criterion. Obviously, some aspects are going to have to be left out because we don't know what all the aspects are, because the ultimate criterion is really more abstract than real. So the actual criterion, the thing that we're actually going to use, is going to be developed to reflect as much of the ultimate criterion as possible, like as many things as we can think of to include, plus as many things within that world of things that we can think of to include. It would also be those that are measurable. So there may be things that we can think of, but we can't think of a way to measure them, and so they're going to have to be left out. So we're going to develop our actual criterion as well as we can to reflect as much of the ultimate criterion as we possibly can. And of course, that are measurable. So that's what the second statement is getting at. You know, it needs to be something that's going to be measurable and that we plan to measure, right? Sometimes you can think of a way to measure it, but you're like, wow, the one way to measure that takes hours to do. Is it really worth it for the amount of variability that it's going to account for? So maybe I won't bother. So you would only include those kinds of measurements that are going to contribute in a meaningful way to your attempt to model the ultimate criterion by using this actual criterion. So what makes a good criterion? Well, first off, the percent of variance in the ultimate criterion accounted for by the actual one. So we call that relevance. So a good criterion is going to account for more of a larger percentage of the variance in the ultimate criterion. But of course, we have to keep in mind there are these factors called contamination and deficiency that can sort of mess up our ability to determine what percentage of the variance is being accounted for. So let's take a little walk down contamination and deficiency lane and see what that is. All right, so let's look at this Venn diagram. We've got the ultimate criteria on the left side of the screen. We've got the actual criterion on the right side of the screen, and we've got some overlap between the two, right? So the ultimate criterion has some aspects that we're not going to be able to tap into. The actual criterion includes some things that are not really relevant to the ultimate criterion. So the things that we're going to call relevant are going to be those things that are appearing in the overlapping sections, right? So typing speed, typing quality, procedural adherence, and so on through number 11. We're not going to be measuring things that are part of the ultimate criterion, like filing efficiency, written communication, oral communication, and creativity. That's not part of our actual criterion. So that would be what we call criterion deficiency. We're leaving some things out of the ultimate criterion in our measurement. On the other side, we have what's called criterion contamination, where things like liking and attractiveness and age and status come into play when they shouldn't. It's not part of the ultimate criterion. Those things are not things that are actually determining success in performing the job behaviors that we're interested in, but they're infiltrating our actual criterion. They, maybe as we're administering the tests, if we like this person or if this person is attractive, we cut them a little bit of slack as we're scoring the tests or something like that. If they're an older person, maybe we're going to be ageist towards them. Or if they're a younger person, we, again, cut them a little bit of slack. Things like that. People who are higher status, we might cut them a little slack. And so those things are going to contaminate the accuracy of our actual criterion. So those are things that we try to eliminate as much as possible. We try to avoid criterion deficiency when it is something that is, like knowable, that it's part of the ultimate criterion, and measurable. I mean, I think we could probably come up with if we can measure typing speed and typing quality, I'm pretty sure that we could tap into filing efficiency. The other two are kind of the written communication, oral communication, those are kind of subjective. So, but maybe with care, we could develop a work sample or something like that that would allow us to tap into those things. And then creativity, that's another one that's really subjective, right? Is this solution not only novel, but is it useful? That's the definition of creativity. And that can be a tricky one to measure. So maybe we'd say, oh, well, there are tests of creativity. We could administer that, but those tests of creativity are not as accurate as we would like. Or there's a lot of factors that we might say, okay, fine, we're leaving out creativity. We're acknowledging that that's part of the ultimate criterion, but we're just going to have to leave it out. But the point is to consider all the things that you can know about on the ultimate criterion, everything that you know is part of it, and trying to include as many of those aspects that are measurable as you can. And remember, measure means being able to put numbers to represent that characteristic. And that's why I was thinking creativity is kind of a tough one to put numbers on. And so I know it's doable, but it's tougher. And so you might decide not worth it. It's not contributing that much to our overall understanding. So we'll just leave it out. But do it on purpose with thought and rationale. All right. So we went through those. Okay. Back to this. Reliability, we've talked about this before, and we want a criterion, an actual criterion measure that produces the same outcome on repeated administrations. So you don't want to develop a battery it works for an individual today, but if we were to administer it to them again in 5 years, they're like an entirely new person. It doesn't produce the same outcome at all. Like, that's not expected. A person who is meeting the work-based criteria today should probably be meeting those again in the future. And so we need a good, reliable test. It should be a sensitive test that distinguishes between ineffective performers and effective performers, right? We want a test that will actually show us what we're asking, right? If everybody comes out looking like a great performer, well, this is not helping us. Like, why'd we even bother, right? This test isn't giving us any information. If everybody comes out looking terrible, we're like, oh my gosh, we need to close this organization down because everybody's terrible. And that's probably not true either. What we want is a sensitive test that can show us who's a good performer and show us who's a poorer performer and distinguish between them. Practicality, another way to label that is usability, right? Can it be used effectively? Is it likely to be used by decision makers? If it's something super cumbersome or it's super time consuming or it's super expensive, a lot of times decision makers are like, we've been getting along all these years without that. Why are we wasting our time or our money or our effort on this, right? And so it needs to be practical. And then it also needs to be fair. Evaluated employees need to perceive the criteria as being just. They need to be able to look at whatever the measurement is and say, that is an accurate representation of what I believe to be my performance on the job also. So it needs to be fair, it needs to be just, it needs to be applied to everybody equally so that everybody feels like it's an okay measure. A lot of times when organizations come up with their own measures, that's one of the biggest criticisms, is that it's not, the employees don't feel like it's fair. And so that's where IO psychologists can be useful because they can develop more objective measures. So the criterion problem. So we've got performance. That's the criterion in which most organizations, the employees themselves, the managers who are managing those employees, and the IO psychologists who are measuring them. This is the thing that we're all interested in. Performance. How are you doing on the job? It usually comprises more than one criterion. Usually just about any job you can think of has more than one factor that determines success. Right? There's more than one thing that we want you to be able to do. I'm trying to think of a good, kind of simple job. I don't know. Bussing tables, right? It doesn't have a ton of variability, but even in that job, there is variability. There are things like clearing the tables, getting them clean, setting them with new silverware and napkins and things that you need. All of that being done efficiently and actually cleaning it and actually setting it up nicely. Taking the dirty dishes back to the dishwasher and maybe providing them to the dishwasher staff or loading it in yourself, whatever the job requires. Right there, I've got 3 main kinds of tasks that make up this job called being a busboy. Not to mention sort of interpersonal qualities where you have to get along with the wait staff and you have to get along with the kitchen staff right? So there's sort of that hard to pin down criterion of being able to get along, right? So even on a job that you might think, well, there's not much to measure. There's actually, I just thought of 4 things right off the top of my head and I didn't plan that example. I just thought it off my head. So usually a criterion of performance includes more than one criterion. And usually if you can come up with a tool of some sort of a scale or something, an observational technique or something that works for one kind of decision, like selecting a person to enter into the job, it probably also can be used for other kinds of decisions, like who should be promoted or who needs training or other kinds of decisions. So it's kind of worthwhile, like I mentioned before, it's kind of worthwhile to work this up because you can use it for lots of things. However, we have to be super careful and not think, oh, I found the measure that will work for everything. It doesn't work for all kinds of jobs. It doesn't work for all decisions that need to be made within a particular job. It doesn't work for everything. But if we can develop a particular measure, a selection measure, it oftentimes works for other things too. All right, this is a really good time to stop. We'll come back in the next section and we'll talk about Campbell's taxonomy of performance.